All right, welcome back, everyone, to Strange Planet Podcast. And in this week's episode, we are going to be discussing what the actual definition and the concept of what fascism actually is. Now, the actual definition, the textbook definition of fascism, is a government system led by a dictator having complete power, forcibly suppressing opposition and criticism, regimenting in industry commerce, and emphasizing an aggressive nationalism and often racism. Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking. Kind of sounds familiar to somebody we all know, doesn't it now? Mr. Donald Trump. But before we start making comparisons to that, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the bell icon for notifications. And let's get this started. Let's talk about what that actually means.
So you say that it's complete dictatorship at that point. So it has to be a single person at the head with probably the military backing them. Most likely the military would have to be backing them, otherwise it wouldn't be able to do it. But you never know. It's working. It seems to be working differently in this country. Look at what we've had in the past with Mussolini and Adolf Hitler and, all these huge dictators that have fallen, thankfully. But then you got the modern day ones like the Kim Jong-uns. And do you think it's going to come to that at this point in this country?
I absolutely hope not, but I don't know that for a fact anymore, the way things are going. But what you said is actually pretty smart. You look at history and you see the dictators and the fascists in the past and how they've fallen, and you've seen the destruction that they've done. And it's like, would you really want to welcome that into America? I mean, this is already kind of a circus as it is, but that's not going to make it any better. That's only going to complicate things and make it worse. So, I don't see this concept being positive in any way for this country.
Well, it's all about the spin, G. If you can get the people to believe what you're doing is not fascism, but it is, and it's better for the country and everybody in the country, then you're doing your job right. You have some dumb people in your country, but I mean, that's a given at that point. It's getting people in the right desperate moment to want to make a change and giving them the wrong choice to make.
But at the same time, I'm also kind of like, the reason why I even brought Trump up earlier was because there's too many of his mindless followers that somehow put him on a pedestal over everything, over news, over facts. And that leads to this if you're not careful. You know what I mean? Because he's no prophet or messiah or anything. He's just a normal dickhead that basically inherited all of his riches and wealth from his family and was able to keep himself basically on the top because of that. And then ever since he decided to jump into politics and had the most horrific presidency we've ever seen, somehow he still managed to wrap all these people up around his finger and they just eat it up. But the real reason why I'm bringing this up is because this is not going to lead to anything positive. You see Trump's fascist ways, which include racism and many other things. I'm a little alarmed at the fact that it still persists as much as it does.
So before we go delve into this any further, I think it is important to note that fascism is often conflated with authoritarianism. They're kind of similar, but also distinct. And you can have authoritarianism and fascism.
Right.
But I think it's important to highlight that in fascism, that is specifically a right-wing term. It describes a right-wing ideology. So people like Kim Jong-un, for instance, is a communist. So you can't really ascribe fascism to him, although he may share a lot of characteristics with fascists. That sort of, fascism usually hates communists or socialists because they are a right-wing ideology born from extreme nationalism.
That is true. It is definitely more of a right-wing kind of concept here.
Not more. The textbook definition of fascism is that it's a right-wing ideology. So you can't point to people on the left and call them fascists because the term just doesn't apply.
It doesn't make sense. Yeah, you're right. That's very true. You don't have to really worry about that with them.
Now you can have left-wing authoritarians like Kim Jong-un. He's a communist, and you have often many of the same results in terms of fascism as fascism. You can both, can sort of have these cults of personality, although that's more, I guess, prevalent or necessary in fascism than it is in authoritarianism. And, you can have suppression and violence as tools in both fascism and authoritarianism. But the tools that fascists and authoritarians use, they have this, they can have the same toolbox, but it's sort of motivated by different things. So like fascism is motivated by an intense or extreme nationalism, pride in your country. And, traditionally, we think of flag waving, conservatives or Republicans. So the extreme elements of that nationalism can manifest, sort of fascist tendencies. And so that's how fascist leaders can emerge from that sort of bubbling ideology. Whereas authoritarianism, it's more of a I'm powerful, or this group is more powerful than another, and they want to use that power and, eliminate
Any opposition?
and anyone that dissents. Now, fascism is more concerned or has like a almost obsession with using violence to quell dissent. So those rallies that you saw with Trump, where there's a lot of violent rhetoric and including violence, actual violence at those rallies when he was running for president back in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
You saw a lot of that violence then and violent rhetoric. And, people were okay with that. They were cheering it on. Oh, yeah. And, he bookended his presidency with a violent insurrection.
In which people have died, too.
Yeah. And so, examples like when Nancy Pelosi's husband was attacked, there were people, sort of cheering that on. They kind of celebrate they have sort of a culture of violence. So that is like one of the primary tenets of fascism. It's sort of like that cultural superiority and willingness to use violence to enforce that superiority.
Right. That's actually a perfect definition. So you would basically say that like fascism is more like Hitler, and then authoritarianism is more like Putin.
So, yeah, I mean, now there are some overlaps, and you can have, it's not really one or the other.
Right.
It's just what aspects of this either person or the culture in a country or the people that support a certain political leader, what sort of tendencies do they exhibit? And they can be both fascist and authoritarianism, or they could be more one or the other. Both are bad, but those terms just try to describe where those sort of sentiments are coming from. In the case of fascism, it's that extreme nationalism and cultural superiority or racial superiority.
Yeah.
You had in Nazi Germany, obviously, Hitler. Hitler decided that, the German people were sort of the master race or the master group of people. And all others were inferior, and they kind of had this like hierarchy. And so they promoted that ideology, and they were willing to act upon it violently in order to bring about the world that they desired to see, in which that hierarchy was enforced. And, you sort of see a similar sort of culture brewing in the United States now, in terms of that cultural or racial superiority. You saw it a lot from, well, let's just take Sarah Palin's rhetoric, for example. There was a real Virginia and a fake Virginia. Real Virginia being Southern Virginia, fake Virginia being Northern Virginia, which is closer to Washington, D.C. and more liberal. And so there's this massive sort of resentment that she was stoking. And, there's real America and fake America. Never mind that much of what is real America, as they describe it, is, modern society. And, maybe I'm just sounding like a coastal elite, but, just modern sort of life and values. We have, technology, and we're the technological centers of the country. We're a lot of the economic centers and focus points of the country. We produce a lot of the education and, just the products and services that people enjoy around the world. And that's not to say that there's, not a place for, other people in America and other cultures, but, don't you dare say that, places like New York and California aren't real America, because I guarantee you that's how other countries perceive us. They don't perceive us as Iowa, middle of nowhere Iowa, or middle of nowhere Nebraska. And I don't mean to single these places out if you live there, but that's not what people think of when they think of America. They think of New York. They think of California,
LA, Texas,
right?
Just because it's big.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Texas is very outsized, but they think of these
major cities,
more densely populated areas that also have a huge cultural impact on the world, and not necessarily places that are in the middle of nowhere, which I guess people like Sarah Palin would deem real America. And I think that sort of rhetoric that she drummed up, when the Tea Party was more officially a thing, that has bled over into Trumpism, and that same sort of resentment that, these coastal elites are, leaving us behind, and we've got to quote unquote take our country back. That sort of rhetoric is what leaves the door open for fascism and for a leader to champion that cause of taking their country back.
I agree. That's very true. And it's a lot of misspoken words from Palin there too. But another thing to also keep in mind when it comes to fascists in general is they're always going to come off as very charming and like very like, oh, we're here for you kind of concept. And like we were saying before,
I don't know if I describe Hitler as charming or kind of charming. I mean,
supposedly,
have you seen those? Have you seen those memes of him yelling? He was not. I wouldn't describe him as charming. I would describe him as charismatic.
Okay, that might be a more suitable term. Yeah, I could get it. Okay, you know what I mean. But regardless, that's still, a characteristic to look for. And ironically, it's also very synonymous with Trump here. You know what I mean? So like, it's like almost history repeating itself, but now it's coming here. And that's the danger. And I don't know if these people realize it. this because they worship him like he's some kind of god, and he's far from a god. Let's be realistic here.
Well, having thought about it for a second, I don't think Trump himself is fascist. I mean, a lot of his followers, absolutely. Flag waving, gun toting, violence, racial, all that stuff. But him himself, he's not a nationalist. He doesn't care about the country. So I don't think I would call him a fascist. Maybe more just on a straight authoritarianism for him. That's what he wants.
That's a very interesting point.
Yeah, very. Got some truth to it too. Because if you think about it, he only cares about himself.
Yeah. Yeah, he'll honk the flag, America, America, America. He don't give a shit about America.
No, he don't.
I think he exploits the fascist undertows of this country.
Yeah.
For his own advantage.
He's only out for himself.
He doesn't really care about any of that shit as long as he stays out of prison.
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to say that. You beat me to it.
And makes his money.
I guarantee you, if he could throw his sons under the bus and dodge prison time for that, he would.
I'm pretty sure he has, in a sense. I think he
would literally throw them under a bus.
Yeah, he would. That's his whole family. So imagine what he would do to these mindless followers. You know what I mean? Because the only reason why he's suckling to them and trying to lure them in is because, God forbid, he actually does win the presidency. He'll probably avoid a prison sentence for that. But, if he loses, which is what we all hope happens, there's a pretty big chance, I got a feeling, that guy's going to be in prison. But unfortunately, it's not going to be the prison that we would go to. It's going to be the prison that Martha Stewart went to, if you know what I mean. But it would still be prison, you know what I mean, where he belongs.
Well, it's going to have to be a very interesting arrangement because he is, going to be protected by Secret Service for the rest of his life. And unfortunately.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, every person deserves to be safe. And in the case of a former president, you're always going to be under some sort of threat. But it's going to be a unique situation where you have to have, 24/7 protection for someone, and yet they're confined to, they can't leave. And, they're going to have to find some interesting arrangement, whether it's confining them to a particular location, maybe convert Mar-a-Lago into a prison. I don't know what it's going to look like.
Right.
But they're going to have to sort of craft a unique remedy for this situation, because you can't, put them in with a general population.
Please do.
I mean, as much as that idea is enticing, I don't foresee that
happening, though,
being the case.
What would happen if he's deemed a traitor because of the insurrection? What if he actually is physically labeled like he can't become president anymore?
That's a good call too.
Well, that would be a whole different process. I mean, traitor is not really a legal sort of designation that you can. There are crimes associated with being a traitor that you could charge him with, and we're doing so. But the punishment is going to be either prison. We're going to disgorge a lot of his money, lots of fines, bar him from holding political office, voting. Not that he would care about voting for anyone other than himself.
Right.
But, when you talk about fomenting an insurrection, to borrow or paraphrase something that Trump said, back in the day, they used to do something to traitors like that. And that's the type of rhetoric that he uses to describe capital punishment. So when you have, sort of someone that's fomented violence and an actual insurrection at the Capitol, unless, none of these crimes that he's currently charged with, I don't think they carry the death penalty, or that they're either, in a, I don't think any of the charges, he's not going to be put to death for his crimes.
No,
But
yeah, I don't see that.
But
He should still have to pay for them, though, like anybody else
but
would.
yeah, he should still, serve whatever sentence is appropriate for a person who committed those crimes. And will there have to be accommodations because he's a former president and subject to Secret Service protection? Sure. But we should make it very clear that this is a punishment for some very serious crimes.
Right. I mean, another horror story or horror situation would be, God forbid, he does win the election, say, right? But say he is guilty of these crimes, which we're almost certain is probably the case for a majority of them, at least. But what is he going to run the country on, like a house arrest anklet from Mar-a-Lago? Like, I don't understand how that's going to work out, especially good old Judge Janine's. We can't have a president that's under an investigation.
No,
What if that's the
no,
case?
no. If he is elected president, the second he gets to the Oval Office and holds up his hand and takes the oath, his first act will be to pardon himself. Never mind that hasn't been done in the history of the United States. He'll do it, and he has the Supreme Court to back him up there.
Wow, you're right.
And if they don't, he won't really care, because what are they going to do about it?
Right. And they don't care anyway. The whole damn party's pretty much slave to him at this point. Like, you know what I mean? There's puppets at this point. I've never seen one man make that big of a fucking change to an entire party. But it happened, and it's here.
They're willing to shut down the government to get him off.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah, that's the crazy part, and that's still up in the air at this point, too. It's possible.
Well, isn't he collectively looking at almost 1,000 years of prison time or something like that?
I mean, if he's guilty for everything.
Yeah, I haven't looked at, the cumulative sentencing options, but
there's a lot.
let's just say there's enough to keep him in there for the rest of his natural life.
Because the real reality of where we stand at this point, which I don't know how the Trump fans don't know it, or if they do, they just don't care. But he's really running from prison, is what is happening. He's running to avoid that from happening, because God forbid he were to win. You're right. Everything you said earlier.
No. I think not only is he running to avoid prison, but he would have ran anyway. He is running to satisfy his ego. His ego that needs to be fed. He can't stand that he lost the election in 2020. And he will stop at nothing to repair his bruised ego by claiming the presidency again.
And that's where the dangers of having someone like Mike Johnson come out of nowhere and become the new House Speaker. Isn't that ironic? Another, Trump touting puppet of his. So, if things do work his way, it's just going to make his situation easier in the long run, which is scary as hell if you think about it.
Yeah. I'm not sure what speaker had less experience. Certainly there must have been at the beginning of the country when, none of the leaders there had experience in terms of passing legislation or, sort of being around. But yeah, in modern history, he's probably the guy with by far the least amount of experience. Even Jim Jordan, he's been around probably a decade and a half, 16 years. He hasn't passed a single bill, but at least he has experience in terms of chairing a committee, and he's been around, whereas
Oh,
this guy's been in office for maybe about 5 years. And yeah, he just appeared out of nowhere. But he had the right mentality about Trump and gained his endorsement. So yeah, he's probably, it just scares me because if Trump loses and this guy, Speaker Mike Johnson, decides, you know what? I'm just not going to certify the election. We're going to, on January 6th, 2025, we're just not going to certify, or we're going to certify Trump as the winner, even though he lost both the popular vote and the electoral college. Doesn't matter, because on January 6th, that's where his loyalties lie. He, wrote a legal brief arguing why the election should be overturned by Trump, in favor
wow.
of Trump. So if that's your Speaker of the House, how the fuck are we going to certify that election with him as
Yeah.
Speaker of the House?
Because this is like a time period now where the right wing nut jobs and the extremists are basically running that whole party. There's no more centrists over there, it seems like. Or if they are, they're not speaking really. You know what I mean? So that's where we're heading at this point. By having him in there is going to enable everything you just said to actually be possible. And I don't think this country's ever seen anything like that before. And then I love how he was saying that the system was rigged. While that's an example of it being rigged right there. You know what I mean? So that leads to what I said last week about anytime he opens his mouth and ridicules or calls someone out and says that he's doing something, there really is like a mirror there because Trump is the one that's actually doing it. So if he's calling someone else on a fault, there's a big chance that he's doing that very same fault that he's calling someone else on. You know what I mean? But they don't see it somehow. Some of these Trumplicans or whatever.
Yeah, it's called projection. Trump is a very adept projectionist, and I think that his supporters sort of, I would hope that they know that to some degree, and that they just don't care because the people onto whom he's projecting are, in their minds, their enemies. But I don't know what would be worse if they aren't fooled and they're sort of onto Trump's projections, and they know that he's lying and they're just going along with it because they hate liberals so much, or if they're so stupid that they don't really notice that he's lying. They think he's telling the truth about everything, like his truth social media. They buy into all that bullshit.
Yep.
I don't know what's scarier.
Well, I think it might be choice C. It might be choice C, which is both. Possibility there.
I mean, I just don't know. Like when you talk to Trump supporters, they will argue to the death in the face of facts. They'll just ignore them. They won't consider them.
It doesn't change them.
When you present them with incontrovertible facts, they say, well, what about this or what about that? Never mind that they fail to acknowledge what was put right in front of them.
Right.
They'll just go off about, their hatred of this liberal or that liberal, or they'll throw their hands up and say, oh, it's all the same, or, but they are afraid to confront facts that disparage or put their leader in a bad light.
Right. Exactly.
And I don't know whether it's because they truly believe him, that they're so deluded that they believe everything he says, or that they know that he's lying and are just being assholes and just, playing for their team. Obviously, there's probably some people in both camps, but I just don't know when I'm talking to a Trump supporter. Usually, I just don't know what it is. And I don't know what's better in terms of how to combat that, either politically or intellectually. Like it's just very difficult to talk with or much less reason with a Trump supporter.
Yeah, and the sad part about the whole thing too is 99% of what comes out of Trump's mouth is total bullshit and lies. So like there isn't really a time, at least that I can even think of, where he said something that actually was true. Because usually it's just his bogus bullshit, demeaning this or, calling someone names that or just being a dick, really. And they eat it up, I guess. But, if it was aimed at them, it'd probably be different, wouldn't it? It's a psychological thing where almost they might know deep down that he's wrong on a lot of what he says or almost everything he says. But you're right. It could be either A, that they just don't care, or B, they just choose not to believe it. And they're going to just, worship every word he says. And no matter what, he's got to be right, which is probably the dumbest way of thinking ever. But that's what they do, clearly. That's how he's there. Because he's made an ass out of himself I don't know how many times. And apparently it wasn't enough yet. I don't know when there's going to be like the final toll, maybe when some of these, indictments in some of these criminal cases get settled. But because then you can't really dispute that. But we're not there yet. There's still, a lot pending and a lot on the line yet. I was going to say, that's what I mean when I call this country a circus. I'm not trying to demean the country, but I'm kind of stating the obvious when it comes to Trumpism and Trump in general. He's the one creating the circus. What were you going to say?
I was going to say it's very fitting that, after, of course, it was revealed that Trump built his whole business on fraud and deception, right, that he would engage in one final performance of grift and deception in terms of running for president one last time. It's definitely going to be probably the most memorable election of our lifetimes. Yeah. No matter what happens, whether he's goes down in flames in at the ballot box or whether he gets elected because this country has lost its way, or whether he is installed by the MAGA Speaker of the House. This is definitely going to be the most memorable election of our lifetimes. And that's saying something, since Obama became the first black person elected president in a country that used to own slaves. So, mark my words, this is going to be the most memorable election, no matter what happens.
And also, one thing to also remember is, regardless to, like after the actual election and the ballots are still coming in, but they have a good general idea probably who did win. No matter what, if it isn't Trump, expect him to start crying and complaining. It's rigged. Everything that you witnessed in 2020 will come back again, whether he wins or not, coming up. So be aware of that.
Of course, what are you talking about? He's still crying about the last election. Yeah. He's not even ready to cry about this one yet. He's whining about the win that got away 4 years ago.
Right, which didn't happen. He definitely lost. But that's true. It is.
How is he going to start How is he going to whine about 2024 when he's not done whining about 2020?
Right. No, that's a good point too. It is. Or he'll bring them both up. He'll be like, "Oh, I lost. Just like I should have won that one too." And it's like, no. But of course, this election hasn't happened yet. But for the sake of this country, we need to really hope that doesn't happen, for the future of this country. And that's our show for this week. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to hit the bell icon for notifications. Strange Planet will have new episodes on YouTube every Friday. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next week.